Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this online seminar. So I'm Nathalie Brack. I'm Associate Professor at the University of Brussels and a member of the steering group of the standing group on the EU of the ECPR, and I will be chairing this session this afternoon. And I'm pleased to welcome you for this second seminar of the new online seminar series I'm hosting together with Jonathan and Nathalie. And today we have the pleasure to have a presentation on a very interesting issue, namely the gap between vote and discourses of MEPs on enlargement by Natasha Wunsch, assistant professor at Sciences Po Paris and senior researcher at the University of Zurich, and Maurits Bélanger, postdoctoral fellow at the University of Zurich. And then after their presentation, we'll have the pleasure to listen to the discussant, Maurits Meijers, who is assistant professor in politics at Radboud University in Nijmegen. So the format is the following. The speakers will have about 30 minutes to make their presentation, and then Maurits will have 5 to 10 minutes to discuss the presentation. The speakers will have the opportunity to come back to the comments, and then anybody in the audience will be able to ask any question or make comments through the Q&A. So Natasha and Maurits, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Nathalie, and thank you very much, Jonathan, for inviting us to this seminar series. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to present here. And thank you also to Maurits, of course, for accepting to act as a discussant, and we're looking forward to your input as well as to the questions of the audience. So the paper that we want to mainly focus on today is part of a larger joint research project that Marie-Ève and I have together that draws on a data set of enlargement discourses that Marie-Ève compiled, as well as on a number of other sources to explore changing dynamics of political competition in the European Parliament. And so far, we've worked together on 2 studies, the first of which I just want to briefly present today, that before we turn to the main study, it looks at discursive coalitions at the level of party families inside the EP, with a particular focus on the populist radical right. And then the second study, that's going to be the focus of today's talk, that examines the consolidation of a pro-anti-EU cleavage inside the EP at distinct stages of the legislative process, so combining discourse and vote choice, as Nathalie already pointed out. Both studies focus substantively on the EU enlargement or widening as one of the 2 key dimensions alongside the deepening of European integration. So this first study that I just want to briefly highlight is forthcoming in JCMS, so should be published online anytime soon. We're waiting for the proofs at the moment. And in this study, we adopt a discourse-focused approach to study the role and the positioning of populist radical right actors in EP-level debates on enlargement. And we essentially asked 2 questions. First of all, have populist radical right parties rallied around a common discourse on EU enlargement? And second, to what extent, if such a common discourse is discernible, has this affected debates inside the EP more generally? And the analysis is located at the party family level. So rather than looking specifically at party groups that have institutionalized their cooperation inside the EP, we focus really on the political orientation of the national parties as a proxy for populist radical right orientation. So we're looking at potentially different, so MEPs from different European party groups, and seeing whether, despite this institutional fragmentation, they actually managed to rally around this common discourse. And to explore the existence and the possible impact of such a populist radical right discourse coalition, we draw on a concept developed by Martin Heyer of discourse coalition that essentially argues that a discourse coalition is a group of actors that produces and shares the same storyline around a given topic. And where a wider group of actors rallies around such a common narrative, then this can lead to its solidification in terms of institutional practices. And to explore whether we have such a populist radical right discourse coalition inside the EP, we look at 3 dimensions: cohesion and distinctiveness on the one hand, and so is there a common populist radical right discourse that is distinct to the discourse adopted by other party families? And then the third dimension, if so, does this discourse have an impact on other party families? I don't want to walk you through the entire empirical results, but just to highlight one interesting finding that also gives you a sense of the data set that we're working with, which is this table here that shows the main frames employed by different party families when discussing enlargement matters. And what is very clear here is that the populist radical right pattern of discourse is very distinct from that of other party families, although of course the other party families vary hugely. So right from the conservative across to the radical left, you do have common topics cropping up, whereas the PRR pattern really shows that two identity-related frames, belonging and religion, are among the top 5 frames that populist radical right parties employ, and that do not figure prominently or at all in the discourse of any of the other party families. Then overall, what we find in this study is that when it comes to cohesion, populist radical right parties indeed show a greater opposition to enlargement, and also, interestingly, greater cohesion around this opposition than do mainstream party families. We also find the discourse to be distinct in 2 ways. First of all, in that they adopt an essentialist discourse that basically emphasizes identity-related arguments and also rejects enlargement on the basis of the greater cultural distance of candidate countries, in particular of Muslim candidate countries. We have a more cautious interpretation of our findings when it comes to contagion, where we see on the one hand that populist radical right opposition does tend to drive or appear to drive a generalized hardening of skepticism towards enlargement also among mainstream party families, especially those that count populist radical right representatives, so the EPP and the ECR. However, we don't find any evidence of an actual transfer of identity-related arguments to mainstream party families. But instead, what we see is a shift from more technical procedural arguments towards more normative political ones, that we interpret as a potential sign, alongside other possible interpretations, of an accommodation strategy of populist radical right concerns around enlargement at the discursive level, but that does not translate into the direct adoption of this essentialist framing that really characterizes populist radical right parties. We do conclude, however, that there is an emergence that's clearly visible from our data of a discourse coalition among populist radical right, and that's increasingly coherent and identity-based in order to oppose further enlargement. And although these identity-related arguments do not yet seem to cross ideological borders, we do see that the populist radical right has increasing capacity to develop a common agenda at the European level, and we suggest that mainstream party families would do well to respond to this increasing capacity. So turning now really to the main study for today, the backdrop of our study is the notion of a kind of dual change of the dynamics of political competition inside the parliament. On the one hand, there's a structural shift in the nature of political conflict. We have shifting cleavages that have been shown at the general level now by a number of studies, most recently also retraced in the CHESS dataset, from this grand coalition of the early days towards a normalization and more left-right competition that's characteristic of a lot of national parliaments, towards the increasing dominance of a pro-anti-EU cleavage that we then also focus upon in our paper. And at the same time, at the actor level, we also see a shift in the composition of the EP due to the rise of Eurosceptic MEPs that have really been able to increase the number of their seats in the 2014 election. So that's also why we focus on the 7th and the 8th EP term, to really capture the shift from in the changing structural or kind of actor-based composition of the EP. And so against the backdrop of these dual changes in the political competition, we ask, how has the rise of Euroscepticism affected legislative behavior in the EP? And we conceive of policymaking in the European Parliament and in parliaments in general as a two-step process that integrates both a discursive and a vote-related dimension. And our study looks at both of these dimensions, first separately for discourse and voting, and then we integrate both these stages to examine the coherence and what we have in the title of our papers, the discourse vote choice gap when it comes to MEPs positioning during debates and then their eventual vote choice, which then jointly feed into the policy outcome that we can observe. We begin by formulating two theoretical expectations for these two dimensions separately, and then we later conceptualize how they may interact to produce different configurations of party change and adaptation to this context of rising Euroscepticism. So with respect to roll call votes, we expect that the rise of Euroscepticism should translate into a growing polarization of votes along the pro-anti-EU cleavage, with Eurosceptic MEPs being increasingly open to express their reluctance towards a further widening by outright rejecting initiatives that aim at supporting any kind of progress towards EU accession or an extension of membership. And in contrast, we expect pro-European MEPs to remain broadly supportive of such initiatives and thus reluctant to openly oppose enlargement during roll call votes, at least. At the discursive level, we expect a slightly different pattern. Here, of course, actions are somewhat less consequential than they are in the case of roll call votes. And we consider that this should grant pro-European MEPs greater leeway also to acknowledge rising public hostility towards enlargement by voicing their own concerns. And so here we rather expect that the rise of European Euroscepticism should translate into a type of discursive accommodation across party groups, whereby discourses on membership should become more critical across the board.
Okay, I'm taking on from here. So for this paper, we, as Natasha already mentioned, we used the data that we coded in the Constructing EU Border project that we have in Zurich. So this is kind of a stepsister to this project, and I'm really excited that we can use this really great data that we took years to code. So as a first step, what we did is we performed this quantitative content analysis where we coded statements about enlargement and membership in European parliaments across Europe. So this data that we use today is a subset of this data. The statement is the unit of analysis. So an actor's position about enlargement is supported by an argument. In the first paper, we use the arguments quite a bit. In this paper, we focus more on the position of the actors. So that's for the first part of the data. And then we also use a VoteWatch database to identify all of these enlargement debates that were associated with a roll call vote. We, over the period of 2009 to 2019, we coded actually 155 enlargement debates, and 47 of them were actually followed by roll calls. So what we did then is we matched all statements that we coded with corresponding votes. But because there's about 30 to 40 interventions in each parliamentary debate, so there's 600 or more votes normally. People should vote in the parliament. So there's kind of huge discrepancy. We get a total of 1,226 instances where we have the information for both aspects of this legislative process, so the statement and the vote. And this is actually spread out across or between 316 actors, which we trace at the individual level and aggregate at the EPG level, depending on the type of analysis that we're making. So in terms of findings, yes, thank you. We start by looking for change at the institutional level, and we actually find it. So when it comes to voting, we find a decrease of support and a corresponding, or actually almost corresponding, because we only use for the vote support and opposition, so we don't consider abstain, absent, or didn't vote. So we see a almost corresponding increase in opposition. However, support still benefit from a quite comfortable margin, especially knowing that in the case of enlargement-related issue, only a simple majority is needed to move forward. However, the situation is quite different when it comes to discourse. Here we find a very important decrease in support, less 20%, and so large actually that opposition comes to head to head with support in the 8th session of the European Parliament. So change, yes, but quite an important variation between the rates of change in the discourse and in the vote. We can move to the next slide, and just to push a bit more the relevance of using 2004 as a turning point. Here we show the evolution of position and vote by a year across the period. So we clearly see that there's a drop in both indicators in the election year, and subsequent lower level at which position and vote stabilize throughout the 8th session. So back to our hypotheses, which are different between phases of the legislative process. We first look at vote and discourse separately. So when it comes to the vote, we first contend that vote would become more polarized across the pro-anti-European cleavage. And in this graph here, we compare the distribution of votes on the Eurosceptic scale between the two periods. So what you see on the left is the chess scale, of 1 is the most Eurosceptic and 7 is the most pro-European party classification. So what we find here is while the opposition was already much stronger on the Eurosceptic side, the polarization of actors on this pro-anti-European cleavage becomes really clear in the 8th session at the European level. Then when we aggregate at the EPG level, we find that this polarization is actually driven by one actor shifting completely its position from support to opposition between the two periods, and it's the conservative group. So maybe another interesting thing to notice is how pro-European EPGs become actually more supportive of enlargement in the 8th session as a group, while all soft and hard Eurosceptic EPGs are either stable, like the left, or become more opposed. So we started with kind of this wide distribution of voting behavior and ended up with two really distinct groups that map onto the pro-anti-EU cleavage, which is precisely what polarization is all about, and what we had in our hypothesis. So turning to discourse now, we don't see the same type of division between groups. So the statements seem to be distributed equally or even more widely across actors, between the two periods. As Natasha already mentioned, discourse is of course more flexible and less constrained. So even though positive positions are more concentrated among pro-Europeans, there is no clear pattern emerging for opposition. Yet, when we look closer at the EPG level, we find a similar pattern as in the vote, where soft Eurosceptics are driving the change that this time all parties at some level are also portraying.
I'll pick up at this point basically to say that we do find a very strong drop for the soft Eurosceptic. So again, in the 7th, for the discursive positioning for the 7th term, we have this very wide distribution. There we are. You want to go back?
Okay, I'm sorry, my internet connection is a bit spotty, but now it should work. So Natasha, did you take over? So
on discourse sentence, so just go right on.
Yeah, so I just wanted to summarize that roll call votes we see growing polarization in roll call votes, yet only partial accommodation of Eurosceptic views in the discourse. So if we shift, and these are the last two slides for me, from two-stage analysis to integrating the two levels, we first look at the sequence between discourse and vote at the institutional level. So here we seek the variation through time and between types of actors, between types of match between discourse and vote. So first, and maybe very interestingly, we find the match between discourse and vote is very stable and high across the period, around 85% of observations. So discourse is not just discourse, it's also a very good predictor for vote. And if we just look at the blue and orange parts of the graph, we see that there's a change that we already discussed between more support towards more opposition. So that's something that we've seen already. But something new now, it's the yellow and gray part at the top. This share of mismatch, does not really increase between the two sessions, but it does change in nature with an increased proportion of oppose in the discourse while support in the vote. So now I think you probably know where this is going. Let's look at the evolution of the discourse vote gap by EPG to see if whether there's a variation between actors. So for this graph, we artificially divided the graph in two, just so it's easier to illustrate the difference between the groups, or else it's a big mush of all the lines. So what we see here is that the gap between discourse and vote actually increases for pro-EU actors, whereas it decreases for Eurosceptic actors. And let's note that on average, they land at almost the same position, the same place, at around 15% of observation that are not a match between discourse and vote. So this means first that discursive accommodation weakens the cohesion of a traditionally very united pro-EU faction. And on the other side, we see the emergence of a more cohesive Eurosceptic faction that unites over traditional party lines to form this much stronger systematic opposition in the European Parliament. Back to you, Natasha.
Okay, so how can we make sense of these distinct dynamics when it comes to the discourse level and the vote change? And remember that we're seeking to assess shifting dynamics of political conflict against this backdrop of Euroscepticism. So we ask here in this table, what may be, or how may actors in the EP respond to the changing context of this rising Euroscepticism? And we differentiate four possible configurations. The status quo here at the bottom would be basically little or no change at both at either the voting or the discursive level. So basically, party groups would remain loyal to their initial positioning in the first and the 7th EP term, and not adapt their legislative behavior to rising Euroscepticism and to the kind of changing dynamics of European integration. Then here, the second quadrant, discursive accommodation. We expect this would be the case where change takes place at the discursive level, but not in the form of adaptation of voting behavior. The opposite pattern then down here, vote-based polarization, would be party groups adapting their vote, but not their discourse to the changing context of growing Euroscepticism. And then finally, in instances of full polarization, we would see party groups responding to the rise of Euroscepticism by making major changes both to their discourse and to their voting behavior, and thus contributing to really a deepening of polarization around this pro-anti-EU cleavage that has been pointed out. How does this conceptualization then map onto our empirical findings at the level of party groups here again? And the reason why we do the analysis at the level of party groups is that we were thinking of following individuals over time, but there's only a comparatively small share of our sample where MEPs are actually present in one term and in the other, and which of course they need to do speak and vote. So we don't have a sufficient number of observation to do this at the individual level, but we do it for the party groups. And we report in this figure the absolute changes in discursive and voting behavior from the 7th to the 8th EP term. And so what's striking is, to see is that the legislative behavior of the pro-European groups remains virtually unaltered. So really the status quo quadrant down here, where we have all four Social Democrats, EPP, Liberals and Greens that basically undertake only a very minor adaptation of their voting and or discursive behavior between these two terms, and otherwise remain broadly stable. The same is true also for the EFDD, though obviously here the stability consists in its strong opposition to further enlargement in substantive terms. Moving to discursive accommodation, in this quadrant we find the radical left, which drops quite dramatically in its discursive support for EU widening, but does not engage in a corresponding degree of vote change. And then in the opposite quadrant, we find the non-masculine. So we see here very little change in an already very negative, of course, discourse, but a further drop in vote-based support for enlargement-related initiatives. And finally, up here in the quadrant for full polarization, we have the soft Eurosceptic European conservatives and reformists, which drop from kind of lukewarm support for enlargement during the 7th term to very strong hostility, both at the discursive and at the vote-based level. So overall, then, the deepening and consolidation of the pro-anti-EU cleavage that several other studies have highlighted at a more general level, here for our case of enlargement really appears to be driven primarily by a strong shift on the part of different Eurosceptic or soft Eurosceptic parties here that become more outspoken in their opposition to further enlargement. So to summarize, we see that there are distinct dynamics at different stages of the legislative process. When we look at the stages one by one, we have this growing polarization of roll call votes, really distinct camps emerging there. And then when it comes to discourse, we also have an overall polarization, but what we say also a partial accommodation, in the sense that also for the pro-European views, we have this slight dip and a kind of an emergence of somewhat more critical views of enlargement that were not present during the 7th term. So that we broadly have a consolidation of the pro-anti-EU cleavage that is driven by a hardening of positions by those party groups that are formerly soft Eurosceptics that kind of unite and become closer to the hard Eurosceptics in their opposition to enlargement. And then when we look back at the gap between discourse and vote choice that we were interested in exploring here, we see that this gap widens among pro-Europeans, so to remain positive in the vote for now, but drop in the discourse. But we see a growing coherence actually among Eurosceptics. And so really in this sense, a polarization of political competition along this pro-anti-EU cleavage that we were seeking to explore somewhat more in depth. So thank you very much for listening until now, and we're looking forward to Maurits' comments.
Thank you very much, Natasha and Maria. So I now leave the floor to Maurits for some comments and feedback on this presentation.
All right, you should be able to see my screen now. Great. So let me just make that screen a little bit bigger for me. So yeah, thanks so much for first of all for inviting me to be discussant on this great initiative. I think it's great to keep in touch and to discuss each other's work and present even in these circumstances. And thanks very much for this interesting read, Natasha and Marie. I think it's really interesting. So I have a couple of comments. First, I wanted to briefly summarize what I understood your argument to be and what the paper to be about. Then I want to highlight some strengths about the paper, and then some some suggestions on how to move forward. So as I understood it, the paper argues and examines how discourse and voting behavior in the European Parliament has changed between the 7th and the 8th EP on the issue of enlargement. And it shows that the discourse both discourse and votes have changed against enlargement, so more opposition, but there's a mismatch in this respect, that discourse changed to a greater extent than voting behavior. And the argument is, and I think that was particularly clear in the paper, became a little less to the fore in the presentation, that this is mostly due to accommodation to radical right discourse. Well, I think this is really interesting. It's a really novel perspective on how this party competition affects enlargement debates. Enlargement research is not my primary area of study, but I think it's really interesting just to apply this party competition theories and logic to that issue. What I also really appreciate is that you have obviously a very great data set, and doing so you include both discourses and roll call votes. often we're constrained to use only one data source, but I think you can make a convincing case that it's really important to look at both. So I think that's really great, especially this disconnect, right? As I mentioned already between, and you mentioned, of course, this means mainstream discourse and their voting behavior. And I think it's really interesting you engage with this question of accommodation, co-opting or taking over positions by the mainstream, and co-opting the radical right. I think that's really interesting. Okay, so I have first a few comments on theory. So reading the presentation, but reading the paper, but also hearing your presentation, I was still kind of wondering, what is the exact gap that you're addressing, and as such also, what is the exact research question? I was also struck by the fact that you say that enlargement, that you study enlargement, because on the one hand, I think enlargement is important to study in itself, and the debates around this, but you use it as a lens to look at party competition. But if you do that, I would like to hear a little bit more about why is enlargement a good issue to understand how this dimensionality of the EP or competition in the EP actually works. Is it a good issue for that? Or alternatively, is it an important issue in itself to understand the party competition dynamics of, right? So I think you kind of have to decide how you want to situate your argument. And I think there are probably good cases for both to be made. But I think you can think about that a little bit on how you want to move forward. And then I want to take a little bit issue with your argument that this is what these differences that you detect are the product of mainstream accommodation of Euroscepticism or of maybe nativism and nationalism. So of course, I'm plugging my own work a little bit here, but what is interesting in the paper that I did with Harman van der Veer in 2019 in Journal of Politics, we make the argument that the EP is not a good arena to find accommodation, because basically we say the European Parliament is a parliament where there are no electoral incentives to respond to the radical right. So often these contagion studies focus on the electoral arena and party manifestos or party positions at the national level, and then you see, mainstream parties really tend to respond to the radical right. And also this has also been found in national parliaments. That there is this accommodation, but in this paper, in the JOP paper, we argue that the EP is an unlikely candidate because re-election is not so important for individual MEP behavior, in the sense that so they're basically always in between two principles, and they don't have this electoral incentive to address that issue. We made the argument a little bit better in the paper, I have to say. Another thing I was wondering is that, okay, so this difference you attribute to accommodation might also be perhaps due to different things, right? So maybe there is an enlargement fatigue. Maybe we've had enough of enlargement, and of course the last round of enlargement has been a while ago, but still perhaps it's only now that we're really starting to appreciate the consequences of enlargement for the European Union. Think maybe about the rule of law crisis. How does these factors play into your analysis? Lastly, it wasn't really clear to me, and this is the table 1 in the paper, is also the one that you presented, Natasha, is so what I didn't really understand here is that you say we have low and high change in votes, and this relates to polarization and accommodation, but I don't think it's the change that is high or low. It's the content, right? Whether it's accommodating or polarizing. So that's, I didn't really understand how a different combinations of low or high change of in votes and in discourse relate to in a 2x2 to a combination of polarization. So maybe I just misunderstood, but it wasn't really clear to me. Then my last slide on empirics. So you aggregate individual MEPs across EP periods, and I'm not so sure why that's necessary. I didn't really understand why you want to do that, because it might be more interesting to have a more fine-grained analysis, both at the MEP level, but also time-wise. Can you do a more dynamic analysis? Because now you just compare these two periods statically, but is maybe a more dynamic analysis would be interesting, because if there is such a thing as contagion, which I also say one more thing about in a minute, but if there's such a thing as contagion, you should see it across time. Then you should see radical right parties addressing an issue, maybe addressing an issue in a certain way. That's maybe also how you can use your great discourse data, and then mainstream parties responding. And in this static way of analyzing that, I don't think you can really draw that conclusion. And that also relates to the last point on the slide. So in this way, you cannot really isolate causes, for instance, the radical right pressure. Lastly, I was particularly struck on the slides that the effect is primarily driven by the ECR, this effective change. And I was wondering, isn't this primarily a composition effect within the party group, with the Sweden Democrats being part of that coalition, and Vox? I mean, it's a super interesting case where you have a party like the N-VA, the Flemish N-VA, working together with Vox and SD in this party. But I was wondering, is that really, I mean, maybe that is accommodation in itself, right? That they accept these parties in their midst. But can we really speak of discursive accommodation because this party just basically changed and it basically has become more radical right? Yeah, I'll leave it at that, but I thought it was a really interesting read, and thanks so much for sharing and presenting.
Thanks a lot, Maurits. So I guess, Nathalie, we can briefly respond, right? Yeah, so thank you very much. This was very helpful, and I think kind of what we were looking for in terms of input at this stage of the project. You may have noticed, and I think there's some of your comments that really pick up on that, there was a reframing basically of what we are seeking to do in the paper, from the paper version to the slide version, which indeed, and I think a lot of the kind of critical points you raised go in this direction of, are we really able to make this about accommodation and about kind of Eurosceptic impact directly, which is also very much something that we do in the first paper, and something that we're kind of not wanting to just reproduce here and say, oh, and by the way, it also works for Eurosceptics, especially since we don't do the kind of more fine-grained year by year over time analysis that we did for the JCMS piece. So the way we try to reframe it in the slides, and this is something that yeah, might be interesting also to hear if you think it's a worthwhile way forward, is to really make it more about kind of tracing the origins of this emerging pro-anti-EU cleavage, because I think what we have for now is a lot of these big picture papers that look at very large sets of roll call votes and say we do see a shift from left-right to pro-anti, but we don't really see where the shift is really coming from. And we're actually able to probe that to say, well, actually, it's not so much about both camps moving away from each other, but it's really about the Eurosceptic camps, first of all, becoming more coherent and also becoming more united in their opposition. So we don't have kind of three levels. We don't have the pro-European soft Eurosceptics and hard Eurosceptics, but we really have the soft Eurosceptics that are becoming increasingly hard Eurosceptic, at least on the issue of enlargement. Because indeed, I think that the point you may raise on other factors, on isolating causes, we're not able to really tackle with the design we have. And so we kind of felt that probably wasn't the best way forward. When it comes to the purpose of kind of trying to tackle these different configurations that there may be, so indeed, I think, of course, it would be polarization around the content, but then the question is, so how do you reach this polarization? In the case of enlargement, it's going to be very much around yes enlargement or no enlargement. And so essentially, if we see that the Eurosceptics are changing strongly towards opposing enlargement, then it is also basically the equivalent of substantive polarization, because they're saying no to an issue that is essentially a yes/no issue, as opposed to kind of a more elaborate argument that I think you might find in other policy fields. I think otherwise that's kind of the main points I wanted to make, but I'll let Marie-Ève come in, and I'm happy to share the slide that I guess I don't know if you want to start with that, Marie-Ève, about the composition.
Yeah, let's start with that. Yeah, thank you so much for the comments. I think we had quite a lot of discussions, Natasha and I, when we were preparing the presentation, because some of the points that you mentioned are still a bit up in the air. We also feel it. But we did look at some of the controls that you mentioned. So, for example, is this the first one? Oh, well, we can start.
It's not. Yeah, I can go to the. Do you want me to start from the?
Really quickly, we looked at the left, whether the left-right cleavage was more prominent, and it wasn't. Same thing in the vote, and then we also look at the topic, because we discussed enlargement. So maybe is everyone more opposed just because we discuss more Turkey or something? So that also, it's similar for Balkans and Turkey, which represent about 95% of the sample. Now it says my connection is unstable. I don't know if you can still hear me.
We do hear you.
And then the composition that was okay, perfect. The composition, that's of course we are also aware that the election means that the composition of the party changed. But in the end, if we look anyway at the chess scale, and we average, all of the individual actors at the party European Party Group level, we don't see much difference in the end. So these are just explorations that we make to kind of make sure we have a more solid basis for our argument that. And also, since we want, as Natasha just said, to move towards more this idea of the cleavage, changing factions and what drives this, rather than really focus on this whole accommodation thing, which was maybe a bit more, even if we couldn't necessarily go as far as showing contagion, but still it was much more embedded in the discourse, in actual words that parliamentarians were saying, so that in that sense it was much stronger. And I think we could push further this point with regards to enlargement as a topic. Of course, we're a bit constrained by the data set that we have, and it's an example of debates in the European Parliament, but it's also somewhere where we see a lot of tension on identity issues. So, and these are picking up quite a bit by Eurosceptics and far right actors. So, but this we could argue, I think, a bit better. Was it the last one, Natasha, the slides, or was there anything? I don't. Oh yeah, because we took the time in it. Okay, perfect. So yeah, I think for me, but really point well taken, and hopefully the next version can move a bit more in that direction.
Thank you very much. I see Jonathan has a question, and for all the others, if you have a question, just don't hesitate to raise your hands.
Thanks, Natasha and Marie-Ève, for a very interesting presentation. I want to bring up an issue which intersects with a couple of points that Maurits raised, but also other research on trends in the European Parliament, and that is, what is there also a role for national and regional effects in positions here? Above and beyond, you focus on party families, you look at changes in their composition and behavior. But I mean, here, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not an expert on this, a number of parties in East Central Europe that we would consider to be radical right, Fidesz, Law and Justice in Poland, are in favor of Western enlargement for geopolitical reasons, broadly speaking. They might be strongly opposed to Turkish enlargement for a combination of ideological and also geopolitical reasons. But if that is the case, I mean, don't you miss something in the dynamics by aggregating at the party level, especially since these parties belong to different party families? And I'm not sure which other, Visegrad or CE country parties one would call radical right, but I would guess that most of them would be in favor of Western enlargement. So that does raise the question that Maurits asked about whether enlargement is the best issue to capture polarization, because it has this geopolitical as well as ideological dimension, and it does also draw attention to the understated importance of national dynamics within party families that Maurits's co-author Harman van der Veen has emphasized in his study, but also Francesco Corti has a very interesting thesis and some papers on voting on social policy issues in the EP, which also shows that some parties, particularly the European People's Party, are divided in their voting behavior on some social issues by national party delegation. So I just throw that out to you.
Do you want to react or take a couple more?
I mean, maybe because we don't have that many hands, maybe we can go back and forth for now.
Sure.
I was actually just looking, thank you, Jonathan, for your point. I was just looking because this is actually this East-West gap is something that we probe for the JCMS piece. And we do find that indeed that there is a gap, but first of all, the gap tends to narrow over time. And the gap is also essentially different. I was looking for a graph, but all I can find is a table. It's not very, doesn't say a lot. Or it's not very intuitive, but it really is just those two parties. It's PiS and Fidesz that will speak out in favor of enlargement, and the other populist radical right parties from Central and Eastern Europe don't. So it's actually more about they tend to be the outliers as opposed to the others. So I think there can be a composition effect of party groups, of course, when it comes to the national level, but at least for this more obvious East-West gap, it's not something that we find to be particularly dominant when it comes to differences in discourse.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. We also looked into it, and we were a bit surprised by the fervor of some Eastern European members to support enlargement, or not surprised, but we saw it very distinctively. And also maybe just to add, still another limitation, I guess, and Nathalie will tell you, people speak in the parliament who are interested in these topics. So it's a self-selected group of people who either are, rapporteur for these issues, or that have some type of, you discussed the regional questions, so maybe they have some type of link with electorate, or either they're from regions that are, closer to the border or something. So this is also, maybe we should at least mention this, or even look into it, because we can test this, if maybe that's interesting to, as Maurits was suggesting, also to try to follow individual trajectories. Instead of looking at this huge picture, maybe we can see something different, or if we see the same thing, then even better for us.
William?
Hi, yes, thanks very much. It was very interesting to hear these thoughts. And actually, I guess my question kind of goes even further from what Jonathan was just saying. So I was wondering, you said earlier about how you can't follow individual MEPs across the terms because, of course, the composition changes, but couldn't you just follow individual national parties across terms, so aggregate at the national party level? And that would get at some of the broad strokes East-West things that were just being brought up, but just focusing in on parties, right? And so, because what I'm thinking here also relates to the second question that comes to my mind, which is the difference between what an MEP might be signaling with their vote versus what they're signaling with their discourse. And it might well be that the discourse is picking up on a lot more of the national politics discussions, not so much the actual substance of the vote itself. So, I mean, to my mind, I'm thinking of ECR not only as Eastern European parties, but also just the Tories, right? I mean, the Tories are a huge part of that in the 7th EP and then a little bit less in the 8th EP, but I can't help but imagine, maybe it's just because I'm living in the UK and being bombarded by Brexit all the time in the media even still, but like, it's, you know, I would imagine that in the context of the migrant crisis, 2015, 2016, Brexit votes, national electoral campaigns, these kinds of MEPs might be finding ways to put in snide remarks about anything enlargement externally facing at all in something like a speech, and then it may not necessarily show up in a party position vote, but it might still be sort of registered in the dialogue. So anyway, that's kind of what comes to mind for me, and I guess probably peace would be the same story too to some extent. So.
Yeah, if I may, Natasha. So this whole issue with, you know, following individual MPs and even individual parties, it's really hard just because it's discourse. In the vote, you find it's obvious, and you know, the Vote Watch, they have the whole section about, is it more what explains the vote better, is it national identity or European identity, and in the discourse it's so hard because people sometimes they don't even speak twice most of the time, and sometimes parties don't even come up twice. So, but we could maybe find ways around this. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it was kind of a headache for me just trying to, you know, figure out which ways we can aggregate, not the highest possible level, but it was complicated by the discourse. And then you said something really interesting about, you know, what do actors signal with their discourse versus with their vote, and we've been discussing this quite a bit, and maybe I run something by you since we're all here, and so we thought maybe, you know, to present something such as, you know, in the discourse, some trying to address, for example, the voter, have some loyalties towards your voters, and in the vote, having some loyalty towards your party, and kind of like, but I don't know how exactly we could measure, like we could say this, but can we measure this at the European level? I'm not sure. I'm open to ideas.
If I can just say something here, you have a literature on the function of parliamentary activities, and you have like parliamentary questions serving another purpose as a vote, as a speech, as a motion. So maybe you could use that literature to say, for instance, the speech, it's more like when it said, you know, to signal something to an audience at home, like a parliamentary question. Whereas a vote, it's more about the national party or the party group in the European Parliament, and it has just another function. And that's why also I agree, for instance, with Maurits when he said the European Parliament and the contagion effects or the accommodation, it's less likely. It's less. I would agree partially. It's less likely in the votes, but it can happen in the discourse because it has another function, because it's more related to national concerns.
And you've also got, just mechanically, I mean, you'd probably have more heterogeneity in your measures of discourse within a party group, right, than you would within, I mean, you would expect to see more heterogeneity in the measures of the discourse than in the voting, because there's going to be some kind of, you know, voting whip. So that's kind of another way you can look at it too.
Thomas?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Excellent presentation and discussion. I had 3 quick comments, and the first one is maybe linking up to this, which is more methodological. I mean, the question is what, how representative roll call votes are compared to all votes in the European Council, in the European Parliament. I mean, that's a problem I have. Traditionally, I don't do vote analysis in the European Parliament, but at some point, at least, it wasn't very representative. You know, it was like a third of all. You know, it gets used because the data is there, but it's not necessarily the most representative measure of party positions. In fact, it could be distorting because the roll call vote emphasizes, party unity and stuff like that, or other kinds of statement making, whereas, in raising your hand votes, people may be more free to vote as they want. And that could in part explain why there is a discrepancy between the discourse and the voting. And more generally, I'm asking myself to what extent, what kind of votes are we actually talking about? Because your discourse analysis was great. This first table that you had with the different frames and so on, that's extremely sophisticated and shows how complex the discourse is. The vote seems to be binary, for or against, but what were they actually voting on? Enlargement in general, in particular countries, and so on. So my second question actually was something that Marie-Yves answered partially with the second round of tables where you had the Western Balkans separate from Turkey. But I'm not even sure that goes far enough, because people could have different oppositions on, let's say, Serbia as opposed to North Macedonia, and especially these populist rights, I would expect, have some countries they like more than others, as it were. So to asking them questions on voting about enlargement seems to me a fairly, almost too broad. And I think one needs to maybe dial it down to more specific attitudes. And my final point is why you do this diachronic thing. I was just wondering about the very starting point, which is the position that populists have on enlargement and how that correlates with being anti-European. Because one could have this yes minister position that enlargement is good for anti-Europeans because it brings more problems into the union, and you didn't find any of that you would actually see, Eurosceptics or anti-Europeans actually being favorable towards enlargement, because that's just going to give the union more, it's going to slow the union down, it's going to stop deepening, it's actually a tool to make the union more like we want it, as it were.
Yeah, on that last point, it's really interesting because I read so many debates that we all coded by hand, by the way, and it was a really big endeavor. We did see some kind of outliers discourse, like for example on the extreme left, kind of a framing of EU as or enlargement as an imperialistic endeavor from the EU, and some on the right as diluting, let's say, widen instead of deepen and stuff like that. But it's quite marginal, I would say. But I think I agree that now that I see it more when you speak, that we're such at a high level of abstraction, actually, because a lot of the comments also come back to this idea that we want to see something real about this, not just like, oh yeah, these first 5 years, these two parties, and then this. So I think there is still, as you mentioned, since we have this analysis with the frames, and now I'm thinking we have to include them, Natasha. There might be something there that we could do to have reduce a little bit the ambition of trying to explain the whole process, and maybe find something somewhere that we have more of a process.
Maurits, you wanted to come back with other comments, and then Miriam?
Okay, yeah, I don't want to take up more time. I just wanted to say that I was also really, as you're answering this and seeing the other slides, I think more qualitative or fine-grained analysis I would really encourage you. I think almost the plots that you do, which were also great, especially the ones that you also showed in the presentation, are interesting, but almost do not do justice to the complexity of these debates, and maybe the gold mine is in the qualitative stuff, and of course you can always accompany that with some trends. That's even better, but I just wanted to encourage you there a little bit.
Miriam?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a fascinating paper and a fascinating discussion. And I'm sorry if I have to go 3 steps back, but I have a question how you actually selected these enlargement debates. I noted down that it's about 150 discourses, but only about 1/3 on votes. Now, are these discourses still on the same topics, or do you have a different group of topics in the discourse sample? And I think that's important in terms of what we just discussed, that you might have issues that trigger particular national patterns and others are that not. And now, if you do at the same time have differences between the type of discourses, whether you have legislative instruments or other enlargement instruments, and that might produce, it would be interesting to follow up on what Maurits just said, to disaggregate more and look at how maybe a subsample of discourses, the discourses that are directly linked to the votes, they might differ. That would be interesting. And that, of course, also is a more general point on the question whether they all come, at least the legislative proposals, through the same committees, because committees are composed differently. They do a lot of the legislative work. And depending on, for example, how conflictual debates in the committee were, you get different types of discourses, right? And all this seems to be connected to the question whether you have the same discourses about the same topics that you have votes about the same topics as the votes are, right? I don't know if that was sufficiently clear, but
No, it's a great point, actually, because of course we can't decide, so we can't make a rational selection of these debates because we have to do what the data that we have. So I think most of them are country reports. So, you know, it's not necessarily, it's more like adopting a position rather than actual legislation, because also there's no, there's one enlargement in the whole time frame, so it's mostly discussion and then very open-ended issue outcome. So, but you're still right, and it's still a really good point, because there are debates about these country reports every year. So we can trace them if we have if by chance we have them, and then I didn't really actually look at individually all the debates, what type of debates they are, just the topic, because of course it's something that we coded, but not if it's what type is it. So that's a good idea, and that's a good point.
If I can jump in here, a colleague of mine is working on the rule of law, and she saw, for instance, that the kind of discussion, the topic of the discussion has a great impact on how national delegation and groups behave. So, for instance, if they're talking about one specific country in the rule of law debate, then you will see that for strategic reasons, the group will stick together in the votes, but maybe not in the discourse. But when it's a more general issue, like I can imagine in the enlargement, you have country reports, but you also have like a bigger debate about enlargement, that then the dynamics would be different. But of course, yeah, that requires another going back to the data and another type of work. So yeah, ultimately it's up to you to know whether you want to, you know, go back to the national delegations, or go back to the content, or to the type of text and so on. But I think that could also, as Mariam said, be important to understand the dynamic of what you're studying. Oh
no, it's true. It's very interesting what you just mentioned about how the topic influences the dynamic, and we have actually the data set is coded in such a way that we have all of this information, so we can look at it from all of these different perspectives. It's just, as you said, it's not because we lack it, but it's a bit overwhelming. When we start to, you know, cut it in all of these different ways, we get lost also. So just another problem, huge data set problems.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's relevant, but to come back to you know, the specific types of activity, I don't know whether you will stop with the 8th term or not. But when I was studying the activities through time of MEPs, also like shifts in the kind of activities, and I don't know. I wouldn't make the claim that it's because we have more Eurosceptic or not, or other contextual factors. But I think talking to some MEPs, they were, since the 8th term, more aware of their duty to inform the public. So to maybe, you know, if you can have come back to the data, or continue collecting data, or have a talk with some, you know, really key actors in the debate on enlargement, to see whether they feel more pressure, not so much by the Eurosceptic in the urban parliament, but by the pressure of public opinion, because that's what, you know, some of them told me, that they actually got the message from the elections that it's not so much that people are so much against Europe, but that they're also responsible for better communication of what Europe is doing and what their job as MEP is, and they're investing much more in what I've called, you know, in a paper, publicity activities, like to communicate with voters through speeches and votes and questions and so on, and maybe that could also, you know, if you look whether there is an increase in the number of speeches or talk to some of them.
I think that's a very, very relevant point, Nathalie. Also because we one of the issues we had with discussing or with assessing contagion in the JCMF piece is this question. So is the contagion really directly by the populist radical right actors speaking in the EP, or is it kind of the broader, you know, hostile public opinion, of course, which just as well can lead mainstream actors to adopt more critical views of enlargement? Yeah, both dynamics are distinct. I mean, I guess we could look into what the topics they are with their debate. I think with the data that we have, we would need to know what we're looking for, because the thing is, it is a massive data set. And for having written a number of papers on this data set, some of them, you know, you really, you know, you dive deep and then you need to extract yourself to figure out what it was actually you were trying to find out initially. But I definitely take the point that many of you have made now to say we should probably be making more of the richness of the qualitative richness also that we have in this data set.
Yeah, and maybe for me, I would like to add, because now you're talking a bit more about accountability for the MEPs, but earlier Maurits was more saying, you know, there's no really accountability. So do we notice, like, is there any because, you know, there's this little period in 2014 where there were a few papers about this idea that the Parliament, European elections were, you know, shifting from second to first order elections, stuff like that. So I wonder, like, is there any way? Did someone find a way to measure this, or is this now? Because now there was less participation in the next election. So is this a trend that's been, you know, that kind of scientists align around this or that it's still that they are more accountable, or not really? Because if they are, then it would help us, you know, in a way explain this gap between discourse and vote, especially for the pro-European members.
I'm not sure. I might be wrong. I haven't seen, you know, any consensus about one side or another. I think it depends on the kind of data you're looking at. You know, if you look at whether it matters what they do in the urban parliament for re-election, I think there is a consensus that it doesn't. That nor the electorate nor the electorates really care. Unfortunately, but that's the way it is. But I haven't seen, you know, a study showing, for instance, that there is a difference between, for instance, Eurosceptic and non-Eurosceptic, or populist, non-populist, or challengers, mainstream parties. But maybe, you know, there are other papers that I'm not aware of looking at other types of data. And I think there's some papers trying to show that Eurosceptics at least increase mobilization, but I haven't, you know, covered everything. So maybe others know of something that might help, but I think it really depends on what kind of data you look at.
If I could jump in there as well, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily about having to have re-election seeking as the goal to proxy for accountability, right? I mean, what I had in mind earlier with the comment about what are these people signaling in their discourse doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to communicate with the voter that I'm taking a position that you have to re-elect me on. It's more about what is their MO within their professional behavior. Are they going to become a sort of national party mainstream member? I mean, are they, you know, are they wanting to stay in the European Parliament? Are they wanting to head back to national politics? Are they wanting to become the rapporteur on the issue? Are they wanting to? So it's all more about like sort of the roles and the internal behaviors rather than trying to link that up with. So I'm not suggesting that one should try to link that up with like a re-election prospect per se. I don't take the sort of Mayhewian view that everything an MEP does must be about the re-election. So.
You know, it's true that we have this actually kind of small subset of actors who where it's a mismatch between the discourse and the vote. And you know, in the data, I think it's still really interesting that it's mostly in the second term, it's mostly, or in the eighth term, pro-European members, and they're mostly the way that the mismatch express itself is by opposing in the discourse while supporting in the vote. So I think maybe also, maybe not this paper because now it's too much, but it's an interesting idea to then look at it the other way, not, you know, what match, to really focus on these people. Now it's small group, right? So maybe we find when we look at them some, you know, kind of pattern or trend that these people especially would choose, because so many more people choose to, you know, be consistent. So this small group, you know, it's maybe they have something in common that makes them different.
Out of curiosity, did you find any party or MEP support opposing enlargement either in the vote or consistently in the vote or in the discourse, but pro-European? Because I think it was Thomas who said, well, enlargement as a topic, it's a difficult one, because you can imagine being in favor of enlargement as a Eurosceptic to, you know, make things harder for the EU. You can imagine federalists at the European level opposing enlargement because it would complicate things in the decision making of the EU. So you can imagine different configuration, and it's not a straightforward line between being Eurosceptic and being in favor or opposed to enlargement. And again, with also the geopolitical reasons. So I was wondering whether you had like some cases of pro-Europeans supporting or opposing consistently enlargement, or, you know, it's just out of curiosity.
No, not that I have noticed, because if there is one, then it's really an odd case, and I don't remember, because again, it's really big data set, and again, the most people who speak first, so the first round of speech is they speak for the party, and then some of them speak for themselves. So it's mostly people that are interested in saying something, and a lot of time it's kind of quite dramatic and on, you know, in line with their party, their ideology, basically. And but you know, again, this subset of Fidesz members that are really strongly, you know, supporting membership. It's not surprising per se, because we know the situation, like the geopolitical situation, but it's still, it's a big difference from other discourse that they have in the EU, you know. So it's so that's interesting, I think, in itself. but pro-Europeans that are really, you know, going in both in the discourse and the vote against their parties. I can't think of one person who does it systematically.
Any other last remark or questions? Yes, Ivana?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. It really shows the great work behind it. So it was really a pleasure taking part in this workshop and listening to your presentation. I would like to add something which maybe responds partly on Nathalie's last question, and something that was raised here today also. I would say that the European Parliament discussions and votes are less about enlargement in terms of binary votes, yes or no, but more about the contents of the country reports, because country reports are probably the quite a big part of the sampled probably that you had in this research. So the discussions and votes are probably more about the contents of the country reports, like the question of the rule of law or elections in candidate countries and issues like that. So the debates are, I would say, maybe less suitable for researching Euroscepticism than for researching positioning of national delegations in the European Parliament on these specific issues. So this is why you would probably find different positioning of, let's say, I would expect Greens to be pro-European or generally, but against not enlargement per se, but against reports that would not be critical enough against the state of rule of law in candidate countries, for example. Also, we have Fidesz that we mentioned several times today, which is part of a mainstream political group. It has been a part of mainstream political group EPP, which is pro-European and it's pro-enlargement, but not because it's a part of EPP, but because it's a kind of let's say authoritarian populist coalition between Fidesz and the ruling parties in some of the candidate countries. So I don't know if I contributed at all in this discussion, but this is what I wanted to raise. Thank you.
I think it's a really good point, and on this question, for example, of Greece, and it shows how difficult it is to untangle the cause, because in Greece, a lot of people who speak are actually from the left. And again, it's self-selection, right? So because they have more of a strong position on this, so they of course they're so much against, you know, Turkish membership as it stands right now, and they talk about Cyprus a lot, and you know they're really invested in this. So you know it's not just. So it goes to show that, you know, these super high level politics at the most abstract level there is, you know, enlarging the political space of a supranational union. It also comes back to really individual choices and positions, and you can't, it's hard to pinpoint exactly, you know, what types of greater factors are at play here, because I thought when I was studying these debates, the most interesting thing was to see like what these people had to say, you know, because in the vote we see very little of these individuals actually making up this political space, and in the discourse it's really, really rich. And then we can you know, almost do a biography of someone in the parliament, and you know, explain their position and their you know, debates in votes. But then I think when we look at it from afar, we lose this, and it's too bad. So with this database, we've been stuck, you know, in this, at which level do we want to have the analysis, you know? But I agree that, you know, we lose so much.
Natasha, do you want to add something? Thomas?
Yeah, just to come in. I mean, I'm not sure you answered the earlier question. I mean, these votes, I mean, can you be more specific in terms of what they are actually on? Are they general votes on enlargement is a good thing, or are they, should we start negotiations? Should we open negotiations with Albania? Or do we support the Commission opinion on, you know, North Macedonia or whatever? If you could unpack a bit the vote part of your analysis, I think you would make a huge step in order to explain better the mismatch, let's say, between voting and discoursing.
I mean, maybe if I can just jump in here. So it's the latter in your question. So it's really about specifically, are we going to vote in favor of the Commission's report on North Macedonia? Are we going to vote in favor of opening the next chapter with Montenegro? These kinds of things. And then what we did, and this is why the data set compared to the overall number of statements decreased, was really just to choose those statements that could actually be at the individual level coupled with a vote. So what we could do is try to see what patterns emerge if we distinguish between kind of the more high level salience, when it's really about, do we want Croatia to enter in 2013? Of course, that vote is also in there. And if it's more about, do we want so we remove those votes that are just on amendments to technical reports, but of course there's a different degree of salience between approving a progress report and approving kind of the next formal step in the enlargement path, and there may be indeed different patterns and different rationales also driving how MEPs position themselves.
I think there is no other questions. So I would like to thank Natasha, Marie-Ève, and Maurits for the presentation and the discussion. Congratulations for an excellent paper, and I look forward to seeing the next step. And I take this opportunity to invite all of you to come for the third seminar. It will take place on the 16th of December, with a presentation by Jonathan Seiting and Bernardo Rangoni. I wish you a very good afternoon.